Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the show. I am here with Drew Dyck.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Drew. How are you?
Good.
And on my iPad, appearing live from, where are you, David?
California.
Live from California. Now, that's west, right?
Yes, well, depending on where you are today. But yeah, and it's the Los Angeles area.
David from the Los Angeles area, the greater. We can't be any more specific than that because his life may be in danger. So we can't. Okay, I'm going to do the theme song. This is David Kinnaman. He's the president. Are you the president of the Barna Group, or is it King?
Supreme Emperor usually.
Supreme Emperor of the Barna Group, the pollster. He's the what like glowing overstatements could we use to describe your position in American culture? Like the premier religious pollster of our generation.
How about like the most quotable?
Oh, that's good. I've quoted him a lot.
The most quotable pollster or the most quotable person?
I'd say person.
Okay, I'm singing the theme song. You know you've been on the show before, right? Do you remember that?
Yeah, but the theme song is new, I think.
It might be. I don't know. I don't remember. It was a while ago. It was before we did video, because we do video now. Hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil and Vischer podcast starts right here. We won't talk to Sky, because he's not here. We've got Drew Dyck, and we've got David Kinnaman, who's not very near. He's in L.A., which is weird. Hey, it's a podcast, so lend an ear. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. All right. Someday we'll have to tell you the story of how that theme song saved someone's life. Were you on the show when we read that letter?
No.
Saved someone's life.
Wow. I'll never make fun of it again.
Yeah, you don't want it. You want to hear it because you're so intrigued now.
Yeah,
You're so okay.
I'm on pins and needles over here.
It was a husband and wife that went on a long bike trip. They thought it was like a 40-mile bike ride, but they Googled it wrong, and it ended up being like 75 miles or something. Wow. And they said the last 30 miles were like uphill in 85-degree heat, and they ran out of water, and they're in the middle of nowhere, and there was nowhere to get water, and the wife said the only way she got through it was by singing the Phil Vischer podcast theme song over and over in her head in the rhythm of her pedaling, and it kept her going.
Oh,
hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Over and over for 30 miles in the heat.
Yikes.
And that's how she survived.
Wow. But I wonder now when she listens to it if it brings back awful near-death memories for her.
It brings back recollections of God's provision.
Okay.
Provision of a podcast theme song.
Amazing.
To get, yea, though I bike through the valley of the shadow of death, thy podcast theme song comforts me.
I thought it was thy podcast theme song, I fear not anymore.
I don't fear the theme song? Don't fear the theme song. Yeah, okay. So, David.
Yes, Phil.
How's life?
Good.
Yeah?
It's always fun to talk with you and just listen to your way of thinking about the world. It is a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And then we throw a little Drew Dyck in the mix, and things just get nutty. So I read your article in Leadership Journal, which is why Drew is here.
Ding.
Ding! Yeah, we don't have
dinger.
the bell. We usually ring a bell every time there's a product placement mentioned, but Sky Jatani does that, and he's in South Africa, although we think he's in Mumbai now.
Yeah, he's kind of all over the place.
All over the place. It's called Reaching Churchless America, Examining the Unchurched by David Kinnaman. And it starts out by saying, church-going is slowly but undeniably losing its role as a normative part of American life. David, that seems kind of severe.
Those are some big words in that sentence, huh?
That's why he's the most quotable person in America.
Undeniably losing its role as a normative part of American life. And you had three main points of data. The first is that the unchurched population is steadily growing. Since 1990, it has jumped from 30% of the U.S. adults to 43% today. How do you define unchurched? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I do, in fact. It's people who haven't been to a church service in the last 6 months.
Excluding weddings and funerals.
That's right.
What about bar mitzvahs?
I don't know if that'd be a church.
At a temple, yeah, right.
Is this just church specific? This doesn't count synagogue or mosque?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So currently 1 in 4, it's important to remember that while the segment is down, it's still a minority. Most Americans continue to have some connection to a church, even if for only holidays. So, so maybe it's not so bad. Does it sound? It sounds kind of not good. So that was like 25 years, 24 years-ish. What year was your Today data? This year or a year ago or like?
2013 and 2014. So depending on,
so
it's very recent.
Pretty current. So, and is the trend line holding up as in, are we 10 years away roughly from churchgoers being in the minority?
Yes.
Oh, he didn't even qualify that.
Man. Just a big fat yes. We started out so cheery.
Well, it was the theme song. We were still living off. We were the effervescence of the theme song. But yeah, when you start talking about data, it gets really dark and dreary really quickly. At least American religion, and that's what we discovered, is that American churchgoing continues to lose its place. And this is the big debate that sociologists are having, is whether sort of how quickly this will happen, and to what extent will the church-going segment sort of, build the dike large enough so that it won't
right.
end up losing all of its steam. But yeah, the sheer trends here suggest that we're going to see a very churchless country, a majority churchless country, in the next decade or so.
Wow.
Okay. Now, have you broken that out regionally?
Yes, we have. And as you can imagine, places like the Northeast, New England states, some of the Pacific country, a lot of the coastal is less churched, but that's, sort of the further north you are, the less church-going people tend to be.
What's the gap? What's the, in terms of region, how churched is the most churched region compared to the least churched?
Well, what's interesting is that people who are in places like Seattle or even, Boston, or the places that are the least churched, what's surprising is the high percentage of people who are churchgoers in that area represent something like 20%, 20 to 30% of a particular region. So even in the places where churchgoing is very low, and listen, we're not talking about churchgoing every weekend for this particular discussion. We're talking about people who've had any connection in the 6-month period. So in the lowest areas, it'd be in the upper 20s or low 30 percentage points. And then in the most church-going areas, most church-centric areas, it'd be in the 70%.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that you have a high degree of cultural Christianity in those regions. Right. So even though there's a high degree of church attendance, there isn't necessarily a very big gap between those that are evangelical Christians between the most churched and the least churched areas.
What did you just say? There's not a big percentage gap of the number of people who are actually committed, basically evangelical Christians?
Yeah, so evangelicals, the way we think about it at Barna, isn't so much activity-oriented. It's really theological. It's whether you believe you have a responsibility to share your faith with other people, whether you take the Bible seriously as an authoritative source of God's voice in our lives, et cetera. Right. And so when you compare that, the highest evangelical market is 13, 14, 15%, and the lowest evangelical market is 4 or 5%. That seems like a big gap, but you can see very few people in America are evangelicals, even in the most church-centric area.
Right.
So what's interesting is that you've got this sort of, most Americans tend to be Christian. They tend to be church-oriented in some small way, but church-going, it's sort of like, I just last night went to a Eagle Scout ceremony for a good friend, and it was held at a church. It was a really cool celebration of this young guy's accomplishments, having earned like 1,000 merit badges, which his grandmother had sewn on for
him. Did he have the church attendance merit badge?
Well, that's just it. There was like the U.S. colonel, military, Army colonel, who was quoting how prayer helps you accomplish things in life, especially since God really wants you to work for it, like a merit badge. and this sort of fusion of Christianity and Boy Scouts and sort of civil religion and American, sort of manifest destiny. It was a very interesting thing. And that I think was for me at least, a little picture of where America is at. We've got so many people who are very committed Christians, and then, certain people in this young guy's life talked about, their faith in Christ. And then other people, like I say, were sort of quoting the Bible because that's what you do when you're at a Boy Scout ceremony. And it was very interesting.
Well, there's sort of a parallel in the military, where there's such a religious heritage in the military, in chaplaincy, and it doesn't quite fit the mood of the larger population anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
Do you see, are the trends declining at the same rate in the Northeast, the Northwest compared to the South?
Well, I think the last I looked at, this has been a few months since I looked at this, but in the South and in certain areas, that's one of the interesting things, since the Northeast sort of stays at a lower level. They've been at a lower level of church engagement for many decades, even since I started here 20 years ago. They're not dropping as quickly as there is like the South. And so, sort of this cultural Christianity is changing, and a group of Americans that I study a lot, the millennials, people who are 16 to 30, they're the ones who seem to be dropping Christian attendance and Christian affiliation. They're sort of rethinking their affiliations in ways that seem to be accelerating a lot of these trends.
It seems to me that a generation ago, going to church was just something good people were kind of expected to do.
Right.
But now you can kind of, I don't know, mow the lawn, drink martinis, and which is what I know you do,
and
Phil.
Still be a good person because you care about the poor, or you give to a charity.
Or you click like on the right causes on Facebook.
There's that.
Yeah. But, okay, one of the most fascinating things to me about one of the findings in the column that David wrote was the frequency of church attendance. Mm-hmm. David, can you talk about what you found there?
Well, in the past, even so I started here at Barna Group almost 20 years ago, and the company is 30 years, so we've got 3 decades of tracking data. And what we saw was that people would define regular church attendance. So we talk about church-going as, or unchurched as people who haven't been in the last 6 months, sort of marginally churched as those who are more than 6 months. But then, of course, there's sort of an upper echelon of that who would be regular churchgoers. And in the past, people who are regular churchgoers would say, yeah, I attend a church 2 or 3 times a week. And that's what I mean by being a regular church member. And what was super interesting with this most recent data was that definition is changing to be 2 or 3 times in any kind of 6-week period of time, and frankly, anybody who had attended once in any 6-week period said that they felt like a regular church attender. So one of the implications of this is that even church-going people and church-going families, for instance, they're very busy with extracurricular activities and kids' sports and camping, and you sort of opt into church when it's convenient for you, and so one of the implications of this is that pastors and leaders who are trying to have a sort of a consistent, series of messages where, you've got a multi-week sermon series, you're trying to build, a sense of what's in the scriptures, and most people are going to miss most of that. And so trying to bring them up to speed, trying to train people without having them at class every weekend is a very difficult challenge.
Right. So when you talk about frequent church attenders, that's a self-identified category, or are you moving the goalposts to keep the number inflated?
Well, we always like to inflate the numbers here at the research company. Yeah, that's one of our prime. It's our
Thank you. Hey, it was a softball. I was just throwing it out there so you could knock it down.
It's actually a little bit of both, because, we'll ask about how frequently people will attend, and then we'll also ask them what they consider to be regular attendance.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit of both. We're not really moving the goalposts, but as people change their own points of view about what it means to be an active attender, we've had to take a look at this. It's sort of like, when we have defined Well, this is an interesting thing about survey research. The whole psychology of perception is such an interesting thing to me. So, do you know, after a presidential election, the hours after and days after a presidential election, the percentage of people who say they voted for the winning guy or gal actually increases over time. So, you know,
Really?
in the hours right after the election, you know, it's pretty close to the exact output where, you know, they actually count the votes. And so the polling actually will say 51 to 49, and that's pretty close to the popular vote nationally. But then within a couple of days, the polling will actually be like 53-47. People actually abandon, or they sort of misremember. They start to think that they were, you know, a fan of the winning team.
No one likes a loser.
No, I didn't vote for him. That would be crazy.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that people do the same thing around their faith, is that there's a whole set of perceptions they have about themselves.
I didn't go to church in the 1980s. That'd be crazy.
And so trying to paint an accurate picture of that is a really interesting and fun task.
So, David, for those of us who didn't excel at math, what are we talking for frequency in a month, then, of the average person who considers themselves a dedicated church attender?
About once a month would what a typical attender say that this is a frequent attender.
That's crazy.
This is terrible.
No, and I know
even in the South.
I spend quite a bit of time going to ministry conferences and hanging out with pastors, just a hobby of mine. But this freaks them out, and I can totally see why, right? Like David mentioned, how do you build continuity with a sermon series, let alone with community?
Are people now? Tell me if this is wrong, because I heard somewhere that the increase in the unaffiliated, in the nuns, also matched the increase in people who reject union affiliation and bowling league affiliation. that the theory was it's not necessarily about the rejection of religion as much as the rejection of affiliation.
Like any institution.
Maybe.
I think it is. I think it's true that we're not likely to join zoos or magazine membership or really much of anything. And I think even the things that we join, we have sort of these sort of love-hate relationships. It's sort of like listening to people talk about their Facebook account, right? Like they love it, they hate it.
Yeah.
And so I think, one of the larger macro trends is this issue of narcissism and sort of why it is we think everything ought to be exactly customized to our needs and preferences, and why we're so interested in having things that fit our little needs and expectations. And it was an interesting thing. I mentioned the Eagle Scout ceremony. I hadn't been to one in probably 2 or 3 decades. I remember going to one of my high school friends.
So you'd say you're not a frequent attender of Eagle Scout ceremonies?
Well, I would say after just going to one that, yes, I am a frequent attender.
For the next 6 months.
Exactly. But it was interesting because it's sort of like a time-lapse photography or sort of stepping back into a time capsule, because the last one I remember was in the mid-'90s. When I went to one of my friend Ron Vonberg, who became an Eagle Scout, and it was a 2-hour and 15-minute affair with military testimony, Boy Scout sort of troops, all sorts of pinning of medals and badges and all sorts of things, and it was a very sweet, earnest affair. But man, for me and my kids who went, we were just our butts hurt. We were looking at our phones. We were waiting for dinner, and it was an interesting thing because. Just the idea of a ceremony that lasts for more than 120 minutes. We can barely sit in a movie that long, and so
if the seats recline in the movie, we can still barely sit with cup holders
and popcorn.
Right. So I think so much about our culture. This is one of the larger macro trends, is that we are now living in a very distractive, very individualized culture in which we're so accustomed to having things meet our particular and individualized needs and preferences that it's very hard for a local church to compete in that space. And the question is, should they, and how can they effectively sort of disciple people in really the minutes they get over the course of a typical month, rather than hours that they might have had in the past.
Yeah, that's a little depressing. Are you? Did you read the book Coming Apart by Charles Murray?
No.
Okay, it was a study of white America from between 1960 and 2000 demographically, and he basically came to the conclusion, and the reason it was just white America is because his prior book had race in it, and he got criticized because people thought it was racist. So he said, "I'm just going to look at white people now. You can't be mad at me."
And that rescued him from charges of racism?
It worked wonderfully. But basically, he looked at class. He picked, basically, one of his contentions was that the country is dividing into an upper class, that's highly educated, college degrees, and lives primarily, they're heavily overrepresented in what he calls super zips, which are, certain zip codes in certain areas that have just massively high education levels. And then you've got blue collar, the lower classes that are represented in other zip codes, and then comparing those against each other. And then what he was tracking was 4 things: the decline of marriage, the decline of work ethic, the decline of respect for the law, and the decline of religious observance. And he identified an upper class and a lower class that in all of those measures are growing further and further apart. And what was most intriguing was that this highly educated upper class would still get married before they have kids, not the other way around, had a very high work ethic, and if they were Jewish or if they were raised, Catholic, many of them retained their religious, they valued it, and they kept doing it in many cases. But even, and he said all 4 of those factors you can relate to self-reported happiness. There's a connection between people that are more religious. There's a connection between people that are happily married. There's a connection between people who have found meaningful work and happiness, but that there's the sense that none of them will try to tell the lower classes that they need to live like this too. That we don't want to impose our values. So this gulf is growing wider and wider between, upper class. And he was just looking at whites. And then at the end of the book, he then compares it. So, okay, now let's bring in other races and see if there's a big difference. He said, no, there's no difference. It's the same thing across other races. But his conclusion was that what held our society together in terms of producing happy people that did well is coming apart, and it's coming apart from the lower classes up. It's not, the highly educated that are rejecting all these traditions. It's actually the other end of the spectrum, and the highly educated aren't doing anything about it.
I didn't hear anything you said after super zips. Because I envisioned like a huge zip line that went across the Grand Canyon or something.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm sure, yeah.
What's weird, Drew, is I didn't hear anything said after super zips either, because I was thinking, man, is this a new style of jeans at Gap that I missed?
Super zips. They're zip codes. Certain zip codes.
Zip codes. Oh, okay.
And if you compare...
Pretty sure I don't live in one of those.
If you compare affluence by zip codes, like you go around, just circle Washington, D.C., circle Philadelphia, circle Chicago, and you compare income diversity, between zip codes, it's much more, it's significant. There's much more income gap between neighboring zip codes. He says,
that's in the slim jeans or the standard jeans?
This is my show, so you cannot derail it. That is not.
That's your job, Phil. That is your job.
And he's looking at the factors, and he said one of the factors, basically, he says the people in the upper class, people that are wealthy and highly educated, are much less likely to rub shoulders with blue-collar folks, with normal folks than they used to be. He said one of the reasons is that women started going to college, so that men are now meeting their spouses. If you go to an Ivy League school, you meet your spouse at an Ivy League school. If you, if you don't go to school at all, you meet your spouse who didn't go to school at all. And so there's even less diversity within families, that we're meeting people that are just like us. He was talking about one neighborhood around Washington, D.C., where they have 0 children's clothing stores and 3 high-end accessory shops for pets.
Sure, yeah.
You know, because no one has kids, but they all love their dogs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there's this.
Well, they have kids. They're just called dogs.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So it seems like they're worrying trends even beyond, church attendance of the things that make people happy are unraveling.
Well, it's interesting because part of what I think our studies show about millennials, for instance, is this real conundrum where, on one hand, younger people seem to be doing exactly what you're talking about, sort of coming apart when it comes to their connection to faith. So in general, when we look at 16 to 30-year-olds, they are less likely than ever to start their religious explorations at Christianity and at local church attendance. There's more on the table. There's more up for grabs. That's some of the downside, or at least some of the challenges that I think local churches and the Christian community has in reaching this next generation. But on the flip side, what's super interesting is this kind of what we call a counter trend that is beginning to bubble up among a small but very discernible segment of millennials. And part of what you're talking about, Phil, is this notion of the tribalism of America. So you've got these different sort of pockets of people who are affiliating with themselves in a very similar sort of part of what the digital world does, Facebook and Twitter,
right,
and media now, is that if you don't have to have a mainstream preference. You can like what you like in a very particular way.
Right.
And so among this counter trend, what's interesting is that there's a group of born again Christian millennials who are very committed to Christ, who are very interested in their faith being a central part of their lives, who are actually even more active in evangelism than our boomer non-Christians. They're actually there's other research that's showing that regional dialects, not just here in the United States, but even in the UK and other places in Europe, regional dialects are actually stronger with certain millennial segments. Everyone thought they'd become, in a digital world, sort of more less distinct, where you
so like Cockney kids are actually retaining their Cockney accents more pronouncedly than their parents?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Because it's a source of tribal identity. It's a thing that unites them with their roots. Jewish millennials are more likely to practice Jewish holidays than our Jewish boomers.
Wow.
And so there's some of this, like, in the midst of this, I call culture like digital Babylon. And when I think of that, I think of it as like this humongous earth mover that just levels everything. And in the midst of that, the things that begin to make us unique are the things that we rally around. And this is a thought that I had over the weekend. I was doing a little pastors conference for some leaders, evangelical pastors here in California. We were talking about evangelism and the Churchless and this sort of research that we're doing. And I don't know why it struck me this way, but I remember thinking to myself, having just completed this presentation, when we talk about getting people to accept Christ and become a Christ follower in some fashion, I sure hope that what we're not saying in that is that we're going to sort of bulldoze all of the amazing differences in humanity, right? Like, would I really want to live in a country that was all just the same white evangelicals as I am? What a scary existence that would be. That, what does it mean to be all about Jesus, having people accept Christ and live for him in a world that doesn't mean we're trying to, like in the days of old, missionaries had to sort of, there was a cultural baggage that came with their Christ. And I wonder to what extent, we can be about the mission of Jesus today in a world that is completely different, is totally digital, is very distractive, is less and less church-centric, but in which we say, we're not trying to convert you to a different, like, ethnic or tribal experience.
You can still be Cockney?
Yeah. But there's a certain way of us being, the scripture says, a way of life that is, in fact, different and better.
Be Cockney for Christ.
I like that. Yeah. Don't make people cross cultures to come to God. David, I know it's hard sometimes to, ask you to be prescriptive because I know you're the data guy and you're describing what's going on. But when it comes to some of these macro trends like living in a very distractive culture, what do you advise the church to do? Do we push against those trends? You know, I mean, or, for instance, do we settle with people coming to church once a month and just try to make the best of it when they're there?
Or do we try to shame them into coming more often?
Yeah. Have we underused shame?
Phil, your commentary, your insights are just amazing.
Thank you. Would you say they're spot on? Is that what you'd say?
Yes, and I would put the Barna stamp of approval on 100%.
Thank you.
100% of your conclusions are spot on.
Wow, says Barna. Thank you.
Plus or minus 100%.
That's going on his next book.
Oh, I don't like that margin of error. So they could be 200% spot on.
1,000% wrong.
Okay.
Well, I would say a couple things. First is we're never going to try to compete, Drew, with culture. And so, trying to find a way to be Christian in this environment is, if the hardest thing I think that the church is one of the hardest things that the church is wrestling with is trying to be relevant, to use fog lights and to use different things. And what we're sort of seeing, fog machines, I should say.
Fog lights on my car.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's part of my outreach.
When we try to out-cool culture, it just doesn't work. We're not going to be able to keep up.
And what do you see with millennials and younger Christians? Because a lot of our listeners are in youth ministry and or kids ministry, so they're wrestling with this every day. Do younger Christians? I mean, do they want their church to try to be cool, like the culture is cool, or do they actually like the idea of being countercultural?
They love the idea of being countercultural. And one of the key things we keep learning about young people, both millennials and really Gen Z, the little bit of work we're beginning to do now with people under the age of 30.
Are they old enough to poll yet?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
And
never too young to start.
That's right. By the way, I have a story to tell you about that. It was my son, Zach, when we were at a burger place with his cousin a couple months back. My son, who's 10, asked his 11-year-old cousin if he liked the burger on a scale of 1 to 10, how would he rank it? And I have to say that was one of my proudest moments.
Wow.
Following in Dad's footsteps.
It's all coming together.
So my son, Zach, is opening up our children's research division.
There you go.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I can see only great things coming from...
So I was going to say, the interesting thing is that this generation wants to be challenged. They want to be taken seriously. They want to understand the why behind things.
Yeah.
And I think so often in the church we end up making things that are too simplistic for the actual power of the gospel. The gospel itself is a very simple and powerful story, and we never want to make that more complex than it needs to be. But when we make the gospel or aspects of our Christianity so simplistic that they fail to accurately capture the reality of our situation, then I think we end up losing it. And this is a real conflict for larger churches. Not that larger churches can't do this; they actually often do this very well. But the conflict is that in a larger church where you're trying to communicate to many people about these concepts, I think we're continuing to find that a lot of science-minded millennials, a lot of young creatives and designers, a lot of young leaders end up sort of getting overlooked because they're in a youth group setting where it's all about sex and Jesus and spirituality, and it's real simple sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. I have a T-shirt that says that on it. Sex and Jesus and spiritual stuff. Yeah, it was the album I recorded in the 80s for my punk band. Okay, continue. That was great stuff. Go right back to where you were.
Well, I'm the guest, and you shouldn't try to derail me.
It's just part of my hosting vibe.
So, I feel what's happening is that we're actually losing some of the very talented and nuanced questions that Christianity actually answers very effectively. But in our youth ministry settings, there isn't really a place to talk about that. If you think about it in a local school, even a public school, whether you take the content seriously or not, you have a place to ask your educator or your teacher questions about these things. But it's very difficult to do this within the context of a local church. And here's part of the issue, I think, and even the way we joke about, stuff and the things that we find funny. One of the things that we're beginning to look at a little bit is how humor has changed over the last 15 or 20 years, particularly in the context of ministry, or how communicators use humor now in the church. And, it's very interesting. I mean, how do you minister effectively to a generation that's been raised on Jimmy Fallon? And not that he's not funny, he's a very funny person, or why is it that Jimmy Fallon is funnier in some fashion, or funnier to certain segments than, say, David Letterman? Right.
Well, I did a talk at one point on the difference going from my dad's generation with Johnny Carson to my generation with David Letterman, and what it said about our values, and how we had to approach, because for the David Letterman generation, everything was to be made fun of. Everything is a joke. You don't take anything seriously. And that has such a huge impact for communicating anything of meaning. But it also created this hunger in a generation for, okay, if everything is a joke, if we make a joke of everything, what do you pass on to your kids? What do you, say to your spouse at the end of the day? You can't look anyone in the eye and make a serious, sincere statement. So it is interesting to say, okay, now David Letterman is riding off into the sunset. Now, now you've got Colbert and Jon Stewart, and they take things seriously. They actually get seriously bent out of shape about things. Then they joke about it, but they joke about it because they want you to know that they think it's nuts. So it's interesting to see generations, how they're using humor. I hadn't really thought about that, but what's the Jimmy Fallon philosophy of life, and how is that going to affect our kids?
Which as you say, sort of Jimmy Fallon, there's a greater sense of optimism, I think, in the core of his humor than there is with the David Letterman. But it's this larger cultural stew. And here's the thing: if the church, and this gets to the question you asked earlier, Drew. See, I think we should be and ought to have a theology of humor that allows for us to be funny and to laugh at ourselves and to laugh at situations. And at the same time, we also ought to be able to say in the context of our youth ministry, if we are using humor in the same fashion as the zeitgeist, as the spirit of the age, which is just to sort of poke fun and to minimize and to make light and even in a Fallon-esque way, to have a hopeful but sort of kind of just sort of lightweight sort of approach to the world, that the gospel isn't those things. It isn't just about being funny. It isn't just about communicating in a way that keeps up with the times, that makes people laugh, that entertains people. And at the same time, I mean, there are times when I'll go to a church service where we've gone to one church where they're very intentional when they say we're not trying to make you laugh, and it's like sometimes they're so boring, right? Like, and you sort of think like really nothing strikes you funny about this section of scripture, or about like you couldn't think of a single anecdote, right? Could have made maybe people sort of like just breathe while they listen to you lecture. And so there's a fine line, I think, and yet for us as leaders then to say, listen, humor is a gift of God, and what does it mean then for us to be earnest, have a good sense of humor? It struck me, I was at this Christian college, and there was these paintings up on the wall of some of the donors, and man, I was going to make a joke in front of all these people about sort of these old-fashioned old-timers sitting on the wall. The ghosts of the past sort of overlooking this. And it was like,
your last invite to the college.
It's like, why do I find this even funny? Right. And I think those are the kinds of things as leaders we begin to notice even about our own use of humor, how we steward our own communication, and why that's so important.
Yeah, I was speaking at a large Christian ministry in their assembly area where the entire ministry could get together, and this was probably 700 people at that time. And the founder of the ministry, which I will not name, had all of the hoods from all of his honorary doctorates displayed along one entire wall of the main gathering area, and I wanted so badly to crack a joke at it because it was just kind of silly
to you.
Yeah, but there's sacred cows all around in church ministry, and we don't see how ridiculous we look.
Yeah.
When we put our own hoods up on the wall to celebrate how many not real doctorates we have not earned.
I had a boss with a huge painting of himself above his desk.
No, you did not.
Yeah.
Was it ironic like Stephen Colbert?
No, not at all. And he had his arms crossed, and he was looking very stern and gallant and important. And it was distracting because you're looking at him, and then you kind of want to look up at the painting.
Right, of him. Was he on a horse, shirtless?
He might as well have been. It was very Putin-esque.
Is there an eagle?
Putin-esque. What are the symbols for the four gospel writers? Each one has a symbol.
Yeah, that's right. There's the lion. There's the...
Is it one an eagle?
Yeah, I think one's an eagle.
You don't know this, David?
No, I have no idea.
Yeah,
This is ancient church history.
You should do a study on it. Yeah, that was...
He should do a poll on it.
It's probably part of the pre-literate communities where everything needed to be turned into symbols so people could remember it. And
didn't really stick around.
No. Okay, David.
It sort of sounds a little Harry Potter-ish.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and there was a sorting hat that would put you in your gospel house. You're Luke. Yeah. What was the game that they played? What was the game?
Quidditch?
Yeah, no, but what's the Quidditch for the gospel houses? We'll have to work on that. Okay, so before we let you go, David Kinnaman, Data King.
That's it. Yes.
Data King, dating king. What? Well, what's the advice that you're giving right now for folks that are trying to talk to millennials? Is there one key point? Are there 25 key points that's your next book that I need to buy for $10.95? What do you got?
You got the bell to ring for the product placement.
Ding!
So I mean, that's part of the notion is that millennials aren't there's no silver bullet or solution for them. In fact, it requires a whole different mindset. Part of what we're advocating is that it's like trying to disciple in a different in digital Babylon. So we use Daniel often as the reference point that the old style of Christian education prepared people for a very predictable life, but Daniel had a very unpredictable life where he was forced to resolve and deal with these tensions, not just like in a 1 6-week Sunday school class, but over the course of his whole career. He becomes Secretary of State essentially of the nation of Babylon, of the Empire of Babylon. So there's no simple solution to that. But I'll give you an example of this, which is that, in a distractive culture, it is hard to have weekly, sort of a kind of a weekly inculcation, a weekly sort of view towards how you're going to train. But one of the things we're pointing towards is this idea of vocational discipleship, trying to help people connect their faith with what they're called to be. And we think, based on the research, that there's 3 categories of callings: science-minded students, young creatives, and young entrepreneurs. Actually, this is very interesting because when I was with Sky a few weeks ago, before he went off to South Africa, he was saying that this aligns very closely to his work in Futureville, where God gives us callings to have order, beauty, and abundance.
Yeah.
And so I really think that there's this cultivation of the next generation of leaders, those who are called in careers that relate to order, i.e., science-minded careers, those who are called into careers that bring beauty to the world, that is creatives and design and graphic design and storytelling and illustrators and all the rest, and then entrepreneurs who are those who are interested in bringing abundance to the world through good business practice. And so I think that the greatest opportunity, or among the greatest opportunities we have with millennials, is to help them understand how that really relates, why Scripture actually gives us a clear picture of what it means to live for God, I should say with God.
With God.
so that Sky will listen in and chastise you later. But
he'll be all over you.
Yeah. So as we live with God in our callings, how is it that we can actually help this generation see that following Jesus isn't something you just do for 45 minutes a day or for 45 minutes a week or even a month, but that it's when you show up at church, but that it's actually something that is imbued into your very being as a creative, as a science-minded person, as an entrepreneur, and that then matters, and that the church is actually a place to be equipped to do that work in the world.
Cool.
Very cool. And you can't outcool the culture, you said, too.
No, but
so I can toss my skinny jeans?
Yeah, unless they have the super zip.
Oh, full circle.
Wow, that was beautiful. All right, I got to wrap it up with a song now. Okay, hang on for this, David. Hold your skinny jeans on. Oh, you know, I'm thinking that I'd like to talk to the Data King and eat some cinnamon, 'cause his name's David Kinnaman. And he knows how the kids are feeling when they want to leave and get out of church and leave the glass ceiling that we put over them with our rules. Now in hindsight, we're feeling like fools because we wanted to use our fog lights and our other tools to be at least twice as terribly cool as the culture, but now we know it's a waste. They just want to get a taste of the gospel in their face so they can go out and into the place to make a difference. Yay! Okay. Woo! Thank you. Thank you, David Kinnaman, for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, Drew, and we will see you next week.